Democratic Party. Horrible waste of money. Because as Roosevelt wins this election, here's the electoral count. 523 to 8. So let's take 9 million divided by the 8 electoral votes he got and see what it cost him. Over $1 million per electoral vote. Okay? That was a butt kicking. So again, 523 to 8. This was the worst, think about this if you can remember back. This was the worst defeat in American history since 1820 when James Monroe ran against who? Remember? Nobody. He ran unopposed. The worst beating in a presidential election since 1820 when James Monroe ran against nobody. Okay? Now, unfortunately for President Roosevelt, not long after the election, he faced two troubles that he had to deal with. Two troubles that were not going to be fun for him to deal with. Going to run up against two things that are considered trouble. Not long after he took office for the second term. This was kind of interesting. The first one, the Supreme Court actually ruled that 7 of his New Deal laws were unconstitutional. They ruled that 7 were unconstitutional. I don't know which ones. But the ones that we mentioned that made a difference obviously were not. But he made, how many laws did he pass in his first 100 days in office? 15. So he passed, there's a lot of laws passed during his first administration. Well, 7 of those were ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, which did not make him happy.
I was going to say that kind of what made sense. I mean, it did the country good, but like closing all the banks so people couldn't pull their money out, that's a little...
Yeah, but it
worked.
Yeah, but nobody knew it would. Yeah, if you had money in an unsound bank, you were going, oh boy, this is not good. The second thing that happened to Roosevelt is labor unions began to spring up all across the country. And there's always good about labor unions, but there's also bad about labor unions. Now I can only speak from the teacher perspective, and Wyoming is what they call a work to right state, right to work state. In other words, you don't have much power. The unions don't have a lot of power in Wyoming. Montana, the teachers union is incredibly strong. Okay? And it used to drive me nuts when I was the superintendent and I was teacher friendly. I tried to get teachers as much money as I could, but who makes the decision of who they get, how much they get? The school board. Okay? So you always get yourself caught in the middle. The school board was mad at you because you were pushing for the teachers to get too much money. The teachers were mad at you because you weren't pushing for them to get enough money. It was a horrible position to be in. But teachers unions used to just drive me nuts because they are so unrealistic. You know, I'm weird. Like when I bought my house in town, they wanted like $185,000 for it at the time. And I thought that was horrible. So I called the realtor and I say to the realtor, you know, it's just too high. We'll make an offer. Well, Mr. Lushan, if you remember Mr. Lushan, he was the executor of the guy had the house had died. And so he was the executor of the will. So they're trying to sell the house and the money was going to be split among his sons and whatever. So it was probably a good time to buy. But I didn't want to insult a guy that I was going to be working with by making an offer that he might think was a lowball offer. I hate that. You know what I mean? So I said to him, you go talk to the kids, the guy's kids, and find out what the least they'll take for that house. And you tell me, and I'm either saying yes or no, and I'm not coming back. Just decide, okay? What's the least you'll take? So I'm not going back and forth, I'm not negotiating. I'm just, what do you want? If it's too much, I'm walking off and I'm not coming back. Well, they came down several $1,000s, and my wife and I thought that was fair, so we bought the house. My point is, we get into negotiations, and one side starts way over here that's so unrealistic. Well, the teachers want $1 million raise, and the board's going to make them take a $20,000 cut. I mean, that's where you start. And that's where labor unions get kind of nuts, because instead of doing like what I did in the house and saying, okay, and as a superintendent, I'd say, okay, board, what can you afford? What % raise for the teachers? Let's be realistic here. And then I go to the teachers and say, now what really is realistic of what you expect of what % cost of living raise? And we try to kind of get in the middle, but then the union would jump in and want some ridiculous amount of money that just pissed everybody off, you know what I mean? And so that's sometimes the trouble with labor unions, is it takes away the common sense negotiating. Does that make sense? And so that was something that Roosevelt didn't like. He didn't like labor unions because he didn't think They had a very common sense approach. Well, he struggled with these two issues, and his popularity began to weaken. But even though his popularity seemed to weaken across the country, he's going to decide to run for a third term. Okay? And we're not going to tell you a lot what happened in the second term. We're going to move to elections because we want to get to the war. But prior to this election coming up, Germany invades Poland in 1938, and it sets the stage for a possible conflict with Germany in Europe. Germany's, flexing their muscles again, okay? And they invade Poland in 1938 before this election. So this action by Germany, which looks like it's going to lead to a war in Europe, is going to be a campaign issue, do you not think, in the next election? So let's move to that election, the election of 1940, and tell you what happened there. Yeah?
I think it's kind of impressive that Germany went through World War I, World War II, and is now like the most economically powerful country in Europe.
Yeah. But it is kind of
Pretty
interesting.
wild.
Okay, in the election of 1940, the Democratic Party nominates President Roosevelt for re-election on the first ballot. And that convention was held in Chicago, and it occurred in July of 1940. So the Democratic Party nominates President Roosevelt for re-election on the first ballot in Chicago in July of 1940. Now, did I explain to you what first ballot and second ballot means ever? I don't think I did, but I'll explain it to you real quick. What happens when you go to a convention? All the states send delegates. And the number of delegates that are sent depend on the population of the state, and you get so many delegate votes. So the best example I'm going to give you is 1960 with John Kennedy, and you'll hear it again later on how this works. So John Kennedy and 4 other Democratic people are looking for the nomination in 1960, but they have their primaries, and Hubert Humphrey and John Kennedy are the front runners, and then Kennedy becomes the one that looks like nominations going to happen for, just kind of like we're doing now. So even though Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, prior to the convention, had a lot of support, that could not have happened. So here's what happens. So they start the first ballot, and Alabama, the first state. Alabama, the great state with the national champion, Alabama Crimson Tide football team, gives their 27 delegate votes to the next president of the United States, John F. Kennedy. So he has 23 votes. And he needs 761 delegate votes to get the nomination. Then they go right down the line alphabetically. And everybody gives them their votes. And they're given votes. And you can split. You can say, I want 13 for Kennedy, 13 for Lyndon Johnson. You don't have to give them all the same person. But they go down this roll call, the first ballot. Well, John Kennedy needs 761 votes, delegate votes, to get the nomination. Guess which state gave him the delegate votes he needed? Wyoming. So if Wyoming in 1960 does not give Kennedy those votes, they would have gone to a second ballot. And all the votes on the first ballot disappear. And you can change your mind. Now, historians say that if Wyoming doesn't give 23 delegate votes to John Kennedy in 1960, we don't have this class, maybe. I don't even know. We're certainly not talking about the Kennedy assassination, because he probably never would have been president or been assassinated. So that's how much Wyoming kind of has to do with history. But that's what happened. Well, in this election, Roosevelt was given re-election nomination on the first ballot, which means they went all the way through, and he had enough delegate votes. When Bill Clinton won the first Democratic nomination in his first term, it was Ohio that gave him the votes that put him over the top. So when he ran for re-election, he was going to get those delegate votes way before Ohio. But because he was a little superstitious, he wanted Ohio to be the one to give him the votes, to give him the nomination. So when it came to certain states in front, they passed to the next state. And they did that on purpose, just kind of a traditional thing historically, so that Ohio could give him those votes. So that's how it works on the ballot. Very seldom does it go to a second ballot, but that's how it works, okay? Yeah?
Is that why they had, like,
Different states. Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. Because they passed down, traditionally they can make that deal. Okay, but could have Donald Trump got beat if that Republican? Sure, if somebody would have came out, they could have done that. And John Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, his brother, was scared to death that that's what was going to happen, because Adlai Stevenson of Illinois, governor of Illinois, said lost Eisenhower in 52, lost Eisenhower in 56. He was a great person, two-time loser, never won anything. But he was afraid that Stevenson was going to sneak in again, and these delegates, so Bobby Kennedy was all over the convention hall, you know, pushing buttons and giving favors to get these delegate votes. And Wyoming, the last state that would give a delegate call, gave him the nomination. That's how close it was. So, anyway. All right. Well, anyway, who's the Vice President of the United States right now? I told you kind of remember that person because we talked about him. Had 3 names. John Nance Garner. Well, John Nance Garner's had enough as Vice President, so Roosevelt's running mate in the election of 1940 will be his Secretary of Agriculture, Henry A. Wallace. He will take over the reins as the vice presidential nominee, replacing John Nance Garner. Okay? So Roosevelt's Secretary of Agriculture, Henry A. Wallace, will replace John Nance Garner as his running mate. Now, campaign promises on the side of the Democratic Party. 2 main promises Roosevelt said he would do if he was elected. What was it? Anybody want to guess? Concerning what has happened in 1938? Keep the United States out of war. That was his first campaign promise. Keep us out of the war. He also promised not to send any American armies abroad unless what? Unless the United States was personally attacked. Okay? So the campaign promises that Roosevelt made were to, number 1, keep the United States out of war, and number 2, not to send American armies abroad unless our nation was attacked. His Republican opponent in the election of 1940 will be a New York lawyer by the name of Wendell L. Willkie. Very, very powerful Wall Street lawyer with a lot of money. Wendell Willkie. Not a lot of political experience. He's a New York lawyer. He's a very powerful Wall Street lawyer. And of all the elections that Roosevelt ran in, this guy's going to provide him the most competition. Okay? So Willkie is a very powerful Wall Street lawyer and would provide the most competition President Roosevelt would face in any election. Now, the Republican Party also had a couple of promises. Obviously, the first one was to do what? Stay out of the war. They actually used it. They used Roosevelt's 2 as 1. They said they would keep America out of the war unless attacked. Okay? But they came up with a different one that was, at that time, probably not thought of very much, but turned out to be a big thought. The Republican Party in 1940 said they would push for a constitutional amendment that would limit a president's length of service to 2 terms. That's what they were going to push for. They were going to push for a constitutional amendment that would limit a president's length of service to 2 terms. Who was that a direct criticism of? Roosevelt, right? Because he's running for what here? The third term. Okay? So that's what the Republican Party promised. Keep America out of war unless attacked, and they were going to make a push for a constitutional amendment that would limit a president's length of service to 2 terms max. In this election, you had the highest voter turnout in American history to that point. More people went to the polls and voted in this election than any other election in American history to that point. Which means that whoever they vote for, they're going to have pretty good confidence in. And that, obviously, was President Roosevelt. Now, in the election of 1936, Roosevelt won 60% of the popular vote, which is a pretty big margin. That reduced 5% to 55%, which is still a pretty good percentage. But you could see that his popularity was a little less, because he got 60% of the popular vote in 1936, and he only got 55 in 1940. However, we all know that popular votes and $1.25 or whatever it is, they'll buy you a pop in the pop machine. And in the Electoral College, and keep in mind this was the closest election to this point that Roosevelt had faced, he had 449 electoral votes to Willkie's 82. 449 to 82, and that was the closest of the 3 elections. Okay, 449 to 82. And what's Roosevelt's challenge going to be, folks? Keep us out of the war. So here's kind of how things are going to work. We're gonna have a review on Tuesday and a test quiz worth 60 points on Wednesday. Okay? Now, in the meantime, I've got an assignment for you. And it's kind of a low-key assignment. Those of you that are gone, you might want to get this from me on Monday.